সকলকে আবারও আমন্ত্রণ ক্রিমিনাল জাস্টিস প্রোগ্রাম দেখবার জন্য। আমি আজাম এন্ড কো সলিসিটার্স এর প্রিন্সিপাল সলিসিটর শাফিউল আজম এবং আমার সাথে আছেন আমার কলিগ ডেভিড ওয়ালব্যাংক কিউসি। In the early hours of 7 August 1985, আপনার 1985 সালের 7 অগাস্টে একলার একজনে ফোন করছে, giving his name as Jeremy Bamber, যে আমার নাম এই চ্যাম্পসফোর্ড পুলিশ স্টেশনের মধ্যে। সে ফোন করছে পুলিশ স্টেশনের মধ্যে। সে বলছে কি, he said he was ringing from his home in Essex. সে এসেক্সে তার ঘর থেকে পুলিশ স্টেশনে ফোন করতেছে। সে কি বলছে, where he said just had a call from his father saying, যে আমি ঠিক আমার বাপের কাছ থেকে একটা টেলিফোন পাইছি। বাপ মানে পালক বাপ, যেটা আমি বলছিলাম অ্যাডপটিভ ফাদার এন্ড অ্যাডপটিভ মাদার, ওরা, your sister's gone crazy and she has got a gun, যে তোমার বোন ক্রেজি হয়ে গেছে, পাগল হয়ে গেছে, সে পাগল হয়ে গেছে, তার একটা গান আছে। সে এইটা কথাটা পুলিশের কাছে চ্যাম্পসফোর্ড পুলিশ স্টেশনে ফোন করে বলছে। After the sound of a shot, he said the line had gone dead. সে বলছে কি, শট হওয়ার পরে, একটা শট হওয়ার পরে লাইনটা ডেড হয়ে গেছে, লাইনটা আর পায় নাই, শেষ হয়ে গেছে। Hours later, armed officers broke into White House farm and found the carnage. যে পুলিশরা, আর্মড পুলিশ অফিসাররা, তারা গেছে ওই তাদের হোয়াইট হাউস ফার্মের মধ্যে, তার বাপের বাড়িতে, এবং তারা দেখছে কি সেই হত্যাযজ্ঞ, কার্নেজ মানে বিরাট একটা হত্যাযজ্ঞ, 5 জনকে কিল করা হয়েছে। In the living room was the body of his 61-year-old father. তখন তার বয়স ছিল 61 বছর। তাকে, তার মৃতদেহ পাওয়া গেছে, shot 8 times and beaten, তাকে 8 বার গুলি করা হয়েছিল এবং তাকে বিট আপ করা হয়েছিল। Upstairs, Bamber's young nephews, যে তার ইয়াং নেফিউ 2 জনকে আপস্টেয়ারে পাওয়া গেছে, যাদের বয়স হলো কি 6 বছর। were found dead in their beds, তাদের বেডের মধ্যে তাদেরকে ডেড বডি পাওয়া গেছে। Bamber's dead mother was in the master bedroom, তার মাকে পাওয়া গেছে মাস্টার বেডরুমের মধ্যে। and lying beside the bed, সে বেডের পাশে শুয়ে শয্যাশায়িত ছিল। and was his sister's body, এবং ওই তার বেডের, and lying beside the bed was the sister's body, মানে ওই যে বেডের পাশে ওই বোনের মৃতদেহ। He said his sister, who had not been taking her medication for mild schizophrenia, had gone crazy. সে বলছে কি তার বোন পাগল হয়ে গেছে, মানসিক রোগ তার, ওইটার জন্য তার বোন পাগল হয়ে গেছে। Shooting her parents and children before killing herself. সে বলছে কি সে নিজেকে কিল করেছে এবং তার মা বাপকে সে কিল করেছে। David, any comment on these, the few sentences, the sister gone crazy?
Yes. Well, obviously the role of Sheila Caffel was absolutely central both to the original trial and indeed to the subsequent appeals. It's a very interesting illustration of the way in which, on the one hand, the prosecution, on the other hand, the defence can take diametrically opposed views in relation to the same issue in the case. I mean, the prosecution pointed to a number of different features of the evidence which they said made absolutely clear that it couldn't have been Sheila Caffel who had carried out the killings. They pointed to, for example, the absence of any evidence that there'd been any deterioration in Sheila's mental health in the period prior to the killings. They pointed to the fact that she'd never displayed any apparent suicidal tendencies in the period prior to the killings. They actually called expert evidence that she would have been highly unlikely to harm her own children, her twin boys, or her adoptive father. They tended to suggest that she would have been incapable of carrying out the killings because, for example, of her unfamiliarity with guns, excuse me, and what they said was poor coordination that she had, which meant they said that she would have been simply incapable of firing and then reloading the gun several times. Excuse me. They pointed to the forensic evidence, or more accurately, the lack of forensic evidence. They said that there was a lack of lead residue on her hands of the sort you would expect to find if she had reloaded the magazine of the gun at least twice. They pointed to the evidence of a violent struggle downstairs on the ground floor where her adoptive father, Neville Bamber, was found dead. And they said that she would have simply been unable to overpower her fit and strong father. He was 6'4" tall. And they said it was inconceivable that she would have been able to overpower him even if he was wounded. And then they pointed to other forensic evidence, the fact that her clothes were clean, her hands and feet were not bloodstained, she herself was uninjured, and her long fingernails were intact and undamaged. And they said if you put all those elements together, it was overwhelmingly clear that it can't have been her. The defence saw it very differently indeed. That they pointed to a pretty unusual feature of this case, and that is that when the murders were first discovered, it was assumed, and a number of people at the scene and a number of people concerned with the investigation assumed and believed that it was Sheila Caffel who carried out the killings. The first senior investigating officer and two of the medical witnesses did initially assume that the killer was Sheila Caffel. And in fact, remarkably, there was press coverage at the time when the murders were first discovered in which the story was written up on the basis that she'd been the killer. And there was no doubt she had mental issues. There was a suggestion that she'd expressed morbid thoughts about killing her own children. It was suggested that she would have been familiar with guns because she had, in her younger life, lived on a farm and attended shoots, so she would have known how to load and fire a gun. And there was some suggestion that the blood in the silencer might not have been hers, but a mixture of her adoptive parents, Neville and June Bamber's. And as for the fact that the silencer, according to the defence, had been used and then taken downstairs and placed in the gun cupboard, the gun cabinet, before she then went back upstairs in order to kill herself, the defence suggested that there might have been a sort of ritualistic element to the killings. You may remember me saying that when she was found, a Bible was found next to her body. Now, the prosecution suggested that was Bamber deliberately placing the Bible there to try and point the finger at Sheila Caffel because she'd become obsessed with religion, apparently, in the weeks before the killing. But obviously the defence said the finding of the Bible tied in to the fact that she'd had this obsession with religion, and they said this may have been ritualistic behaviour on her part, which was entirely consistent with her taking the silencer downstairs and placing it in the gun cupboard and then calmly going back upstairs before she turned the gun on herself. So you can see, Shafi, depending on which angle you come at it from, whether you're prosecuting or defending, it is possible to point to any number of factors which appear to support the narrative which you are putting forward.
Yep.
That all ties into the question, really, of whether it was Sheila Caffel who'd basically gone mad and done the killings herself.
Yeah. Doshok, at first, police did suspect sister, যে পুলিশে কিন্তু who had been found with her fingers around the .22 caliber rifle used to shoot all five. The police প্রথমে আসলে সাসপেক্ট করছিল বোনকে, ওই মেয়েকে, কারণ তার ফিঙ্গার্স ওই যে রাইফেল যে ক্যালিবারের যে অ্যারাউন্ড যেটা ছিল ওইটা যেটা ইউজ করছে ওখানে তার ফিঙ্গার ইয়াগুলা পাইছে, ফিঙ্গার প্রিন্টস পাইছিল। তো ওই her fingers around the .22 caliber rifle used to shoot all those five people. Suspicion then fell on this man when his then girlfriend, তার গার্লফ্রেন্ড যে ওইটা সবগুলা তখন আবিষ্কার করছে। যখন গার্লফ্রেন্ড বলছিল কি পুলিশের কাছে, she told them, police, he had plotted to kill his parents for his 436,000 inheritance. যখন গার্লফ্রেন্ড বলছে কি সে এই ব্যক্তি প্লট করেছিল তার পালক মাকে এবং পালক বাপকে কিল করার জন্য, তার কারণটা হইল কি 436,000 পাউন্ড উত্তরাধিকার পাওয়ার জন্য। What's your comment on this, David?
Yes,
436,000 pound inheritance.
Yeah, and of course the fact that the information about him allegedly having plotted the killing in order to get the inheritance came from his jilted girlfriend, Julie Mugford. It's right to say that the prosecution attached really substantial significance to the fact that Jeremy Bamber could expect to receive that £436,000 inheritance from his wealthy parents. That was put forward as one of the key motives on his part for the killings. But it is right to say that the evidence that he talked about that came from his girlfriend, Julie Mugford. I mean, the defence faced a difficulty at trial because there were a number of witnesses who testified to his supposed hatred of his family. And then on top of that, you had Julie Mugford saying that he talked about doing this in order to inherit the money. The defence at trial sought to explain all of that away by saying, amongst other things, that the witnesses who talked about his hatred of his family were either mistaken, they'd misinterpreted things that he'd said, or alternatively that they were just deliberately lying to fit him up for the killings. And as far as Julie Mugford was concerned, the defence were unequivocal about it. They said she was lying. They said she was a woman scorned. She was a jilted lover, a jilted girlfriend. And they said that she had deliberately told lies in order to frame him for the killings, on the basis that if she couldn't have him, no other woman could have him either. In other words, she basically wanted him prosecuted and convicted and sentenced to imprisonment for a long term of imprisonment, because in prison he wouldn't be able to go out with anybody else, having previously jilted her. So that was the defence case in relation to Julie Mugford and the suggestion that he talked about doing something about along these lines in order to inherit all of that money from his adoptive parents.
Yeah. দর্শক, সেই 1985 এর কিলিং 1986 এ আপনার তাকে কনভিক্টেড করা হয়েছিল, লাইফ সেন্টেন্স দেওয়া হয়েছিল, কিন্তু সে এখনো ফাইট করে যাচ্ছে। এখনো আপনার কোর্ট কেসের মধ্যে, গত বছরও এটা হাই কোর্টে গেছে, সে এটাকে চ্যালেঞ্জ করতেছে এখনো। At Bamber's trial, ওই ট্রায়ালের মধ্যে at Chelmsford Crown Court in 1986, she said, মানে ওই যে গার্লফ্রেন্ডে যে ছিল সে বলছে কি, he had talked of sedating his parents and setting fire to the farmhouse but had changed the plan to hiring an assassin. সে বলছে কি ক্রাউন কোর্টের কাছে তার গার্লফ্রেন্ড বলছে ট্রায়ালের সময় সে প্রথমে তার মা বাবাকে সেডেটিং করা মানে শ্রান্ত করে ফেলা, টায়ার্ড করে দেওয়া, একদম পরিশ্রান্ত করে দেওয়া, মানে ওই যে ওষুধ খাওয়াইয়া দেওয়া ওইরকম আর কি, মানে তাকে পরিশ্রান্ত করে দেওয়া, এবং তারপরে ঘরের মধ্যে আগুন ধরাইয়া দেওয়া ওই বাড়ির মধ্যে। ওইটা ছিল তার প্ল্যান, বাট সেইটাকে চেঞ্জ করে তার প্ল্যান করছিল কি পরে একজন গুপ্ত হত্যাকারী হায়ার করার জন্য। ওইটা তার গার্লফ্রেন্ড ক্রাউন কোর্টের কাছে যাইয়া বলছে। A silencer which allegedly had traces of sister's blood on it was found in a cupboard 3 days after the shootings. একটা সাইলেন্সার যেটা বলা হয়েছিল কি ইউজ করা হয়েছিল ট্রেসেস যেখানে সিস্টারের ব্লাড পাওয়া গেছিল সেটা কাপবোর্ডের মধ্যে 3 দিন পরে তারা পাইছে, ওই হত্যাযজ্ঞের 3 দিন পরে। The trial heard expert evidence that sister could not have replaced the silencer in the cupboard given her injuries from the first shot and no traces of gun oil were found on her night dress. এবং যারা এক্সপার্ট, আমরা কিন্তু ক্রিমিনাল কেসের জন্য আমরা এক্সপার্ট এনগেজ, আমরা ফরেনসিক এক্সপার্ট এবং বিভিন্ন ধরনের এক্সপার্ট মনে করেন আছে, ফ্রড কেসের জন্য আছে, মার্ডার কেসের জন্য আছে, বিভিন্ন ধরনের এক্সপার্ট আমাদের লিস্ট অফ এক্সপার্টরা আছে। আমরা তাদেরকে এনগেজ করি, তাদেরকে একটা স্পেসিফিক কাজ আমরা তাদেরকে দিই, তোমরা এটা অ্যানালাইজ করো, এটা দেখো এটা সম্ভব কিনা, তখন তাদের এক্সপার্ট ওপিনিয়ন মতামত তারা দেয়। এবং ও বলছে কি এটা তার পক্ষে, ওই মেয়ের পক্ষে এটা করা সম্ভব ছিল না, এটা এক্সপার্টরা বলছে। সেন্টেন্সিং দ্য ম্যান, যখন সেন্টেন্স দিচ্ছিল ওই ব্যক্তিকে to 5 life prison terms, the judge, Mr. Justice Drake, said, what did he say? He said, worked an evil beyond belief. সে বলছে কি সে খুব একটা খারাপ লোক, বিশ্বাসের বাইরে, অবিশ্বাস্য ধরনের সে একজন খারাপ লোক। What's your opinion, David, on this point? Judge gave him 5 life prison sentence, and he said worked an evil beyond belief.
Yes, well, I suppose the first point to make is when Jeremy Bamber was convicted of the murders on the 28th of October 86, 5 murders in total, 2 parents, his 2 nephews and his adopted sister, he was bound to then receive 5 life terms because the life sentence for murder is mandatory. So he was always going to receive 5 life terms once he'd been convicted of the 5 murders. It's right to say that the system now is the tariff, that is the sort of minimum term that the convicted defendant has to serve when the life term is imposed, has to be reviewed. And the tariff for this case was reviewed in 2008 by a High Court judge who ordered that Jeremy Bamber should never be released from prison. So you may think that was that was consistent with the view taken by Mr. Justice Drake when he was passing sentence, and he made the remarks that you just mentioned to your viewers. Strong words, but understandably strong words, you may think. I mean, the judge, when sentencing, has to be faithful to the jury's verdict. This man had just been convicted of 5 killings, and I said at the very beginning of my answers to you, Shafi, that this is one of the most notorious murder cases in recent years. And the reason for that, amongst other things, is that the facts are just so lurid. I mean, if you look at the basic facts of this case, this is a man who, if his convictions are correct, killed 5 members of his own family. He then tried to place the blame on one of his own victims, his adoptive sister, Sheila Caffel. He had shot them in cold blood, effectively in their beds as they slept. I mean, it's right to say that his mother had managed to get out of bed and make it to the door of the bedroom, I think, before she collapsed and died. His father, adoptive father, Neville, got a little further, and there was the struggle downstairs on the ground floor. But they'd all been shot in their beds, and the twin boys effectively shot in their sleep. And just think about that. 2 of the victims were his 6-year-old nephews. And then you add to the mix the fact that, according to the prosecution, the motivation that he had for carrying out these terrible killings was basically greed and wanting to inherit a very substantial sum of money, which he stood to inherit from his adoptive parents. If you put all of those basic elements of this case together, and if you accept, as many people do unequivocally, and as the sentencing judge had to when passing sentence, if you accept that Bamba did in fact carry out these killings, being faithful to the jury's verdict, what else was the sentencing judge going to say? I mean, it's difficult to think. If it is right that he carried out these killings as alleged by the prosecution, it's difficult to think of a more lurid or more terrible case. So entirely unsurprising that the sentencing judge used the words that he did when passing sentence. And entirely unsurprising again, I would have thought, and I think most people would agree with me, that when the length of that sentence came to be reviewed by another High Court judge in 2008, so 23 years after the sentence was imposed, it's entirely unsurprising that Mr. Justice Tugendhat, the judge who dealt with the review of the tariff back in 2008, ordered that Bamba should never be released from prison. There are very few prisoners in the prison estate who are subject to what's called a whole life tariff, but very few, and they tend to be the most notorious cases.
Yeah.
And Bamba is, as I've said, one of the most notorious and now controversial cases that's been before our courts in the last few decades.
Yeah. Okay, that's good. Let us go to the one by one. We have more questions to put to you because we want to give some specific, the basic information so that people can understand what is this, at least, the basic background of the case. His first appeal was dismissed in 1989. দর্শক, তার প্রথম অ্যাপিল যেটা 1986 সালে ট্রায়াল হয়েছিল, ওইটা ডিসমিস হয়েছিল আপনার 1989 সালে, 3 years after his conviction. 3 বছর পরে, তার কনভিকশনের 3 বছর পরে. But the case was sent back to the Court of Appeal in 2001. কিন্তু ওইটা কেসটা পাঠানো হয়েছিল কোর্ট অফ অ্যাপিলে again 2001-এ. His lawyers claimed new DNA tests suggested blood found on the murder weapon could have belonged to his parents, not his sister. বলতেছে কি, যেখানে যে ডিএনএ যেটা পাওয়া গেছে সেটা হতে পারে যে তার প্যারেন্টসের, ওইটা তার সিস্টার, নট হিজ সিস্টার, তার সিস্টারের না. এবং rejecting his appeal in December 2002, ওইটা 2002 সালে কোর্ট অফ অ্যাপিলে রিজেক্ট করার সময় Lord Justice K said that blood evidence used in the original trial still stood. দর্শক, কুইন্স কাউন্সিল কিউসিরা এত ইম্পর্টেন্ট, ওনারা কিন্তু লিগাল আর্গুমেন্ট করেন. আমি আমার একজন ক্লায়েন্টকে বোঝানোর চেষ্টা করতেছিলাম মার্ডার কেসের জন্য যে ডিফারেন্সটা কি, যে কুইন্স কাউন্সিলদের এক্সপেরিয়েন্স, কিউসিদের এক্সপার্টিস, লিগাল আর্গুমেন্টের যে ক্যাপাসিটি, এক্সপেরিয়েন্স এন্ড নলেজ ভাস্ট, ওনারা এটাকে কন্টিনিউ করছেন এবং তারপরেও জাজ বলছে কি দ্যাট এভিডেন্স দ্য ব্লাড এভিডেন্স যেটা পাইছে ওইটা ঠিকই আছে। Do you have anything to say on this point, David? That blood evidence used in the beginning, in the original trial, still stood. You challenge a lot of things, lot of issues. You fight the case in the court. You get to the bottom of the evidence. You get the CPS. Give it to us. We need it. These are important. I know how hard you work, even doing all this side for the help of the community members. And you also a proper defender. You seek the information. I also know you do the prosecution also. So you have the experience in every single way. Talk about this sentence, what you have to say, please.
I think probably the main point to make about that is that it's right to say that the defence in that appeal in 2002 mounted a root and branch attack on the forensic evidence relating to the blood found on the silencer. It was a very important part of the prosecution's case that that Sheila Cappell's blood was found on the silencer. And one can understand why the prosecution placed such reliance on that. Very difficult.
I think we have to come back to that point in the next segment. I have taken a bit longer time to explain this to the audience. We will go for a short break. দর্শক আমরা একটা short break এ যাচ্ছি। ব্রেকের পরে আমরা আবার ফিরে আসবো। আমার colleague David Wallbank QC will answer on this point in the next segment at the beginning. সবাই আমাদের Shafiul Azam এবং আমার সাথে আছেন আমার colleague David Wallbank QC.